I cannot pinpoint a moment when I became politicized, when I knew that I would spend my life in the liberation struggle. To be an African in South Africa means that one is politicized from the moment of one's birth, whether one acknowledges it or not. An African child is born in an Africans only hospital, taken home in an Africans only bus, lives in an Africans only area, and attends Africans only schools, if he attends schools at all. When he grows up, he can hold Africans only jobs, rent a house in Africans only townships, ride African only train, and he be stopped at any time of the day or night and be ordered to produce a pass, without which he can be arrested and thrown in jail. His life is circumscribed by racist laws and regulations that cripple his growth, dim his potential, and stunt his life. This was the reality, and one could deal with it in a myriad of ways. I had no epiphany, no singular revelation, no moment of truth, but a steady accumulation of 1,000 slights, 1,000 indignities, and 1,000 unremembered moments produced in me an anger, a rebelliousness, a desire to fight the system that imprisoned my people. There was no particular day on which I said, henceforth I will devote myself to the liberation of my people. Instead, I simply found myself doing so and could not do otherwise. I have mentioned many of the people who influenced me, but more and more I had come under the wise tutelage of Walter Sisulu. Walter was strong, reasonable, practical, and dedicated. He never lost his head in a crisis. He was often silent when others were shouting. He believed that the African National Congress was the means to effect change in South Africa, the repository of black hopes and aspirations. Sometimes one can judge an organization by the people who belong to it, and I knew that I would be proud to belong to any organization of which Walter was a member. At the time, there were few options. The ANG was the one organization that welcomed everyone, that saw itself as a great umbrella under which all Africans could find shelter. Change was in the air in the 1940s. The Atlantic Charter of 1941, signed by Roosevelt and Churchill, reaffirmed faith in the dignity of each human being and propagated a host of democratic principles. Some in the West saw the Charter as empty promises, but not those of us in Africa. Inspired by the Atlantic Charter and the fight of the Allies against tyranny and oppression, the ANC created its own charter called African Claims, which called for full citizenship for all Africans, the right to buy land, and the repeal of all discriminatory legislation. We hoped that the government and the ordinary South Africans would see that the principles they were fighting for in Europe were the same ones we were advocating at home. Walter's house in Orlando was a mecca for activists and ANC members. It was a warm, welcoming place, and I was often there to sample either a political discussion or Ma Sisulu's cooking. One night in 1943, I met Anton Lembede, who held Master of Arts and Bachelor of Law degrees and AP MDA. From the moment I heard Lembede speak, I knew I was seeing a magnetic personality who thought in original and often startling ways. He was then one of a handful of African lawyers in the whole of South Africa and was the legal partner of the Venerable Dr. Pixley Kaseme, one of the founders of the ANC. Lembede said that Africa was a black man's continent, and it was up to Africans to reassert themselves and reclaim what was rightfully theirs. He hated the idea of the black inferiority complex and castigated what he called the worship and idealization of the West and its ideas. The inferiority complex, he affirmed, was the greatest barrier to liberation. He noted that wherever the African had been given the opportunity, he was capable of developing to the same extent as the white man, citing such African heroes as Marcus Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Haile Selassie. The color of my skin is beautiful, he said, like the black soil of Mother Africa. He believed blacks had to improve their own self-image before they could initiate successful mass action. He preached self-reliance and self-determination and called his philosophy Africanism. We took it for granted that one day he would lead the ANC. Lembede declared that a new spirit was stirring among the people, that ethnic differences were melting away, that young men and women thought of themselves as Africans first and foremost, not as Zujas or Nethebelis or Tswana. Lembebe, whose father was an illiterate Zulu peasant from Natal, had trained as a teacher at Adams College, an American Board of Missions institution. He had taught for years in the Orange Free State, learned Afrikaans, and had come to see Afrikaner nationalism as a prototype of African nationalism. As Lembede later wrote in the newspaper, Inkundla ya Bantu, an African newspaper in Natal, the history of modern times is the history of nationalism. Nationalism has been tested in the people's struggles and the fires of battle and found to be the only antidote against foreign rule and modern imperialism. It is for that reason that the great imperialistic powers feverishly endeavor with all their might to discourage and eradicate all nationalistic tendencies among their alien subjects. For that purpose, huge and enormous sums of money are lavishly expended on propaganda against nationalism, which is dismissed as narrow, barbarous, uncultured, devilish, etc. Some alien subjects become dupes of this sinister propaganda and consequently become tools or instruments of imperialism, for which great service they are highly praised by the imperialistic power and showered with such epithets as culture, liberal, progressive, broad-minded, etc. Lembede's views struck a chord in me. I, too, had been susceptible to paternalistic British colonialism and the appeal of being perceived by whites as cultured and progressive and civilized. I was already on my way to being drawn into the black elite that Britain sought to create in Africa. That is what everyone from the region to Mr. Sadelsky had wanted for me. But it was an illusion. Like Lembede, I came to see the antidote as militant African nationalism. Lembede's friend and partner was Peter MDA, better known as AP, while Lembede tended to imprecision and was inclined to be verbose. MDA was controlled and exact. Lembede could be vague and mystical. MDA was specific and scientific. MDA's practicality was a perfect foil for Lembede's idealism. Other young men were thinking along the same lines, and we would all meet to discuss these ideas. In addition to Lembede and MDA, these men included Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, Dr. Lionel Mazumbizi, Victor Membodo, my former teacher at Helltown, William Nakomo, a medical student who was a member of the CP, Jordan Negubene, a journalist from Natal who worked for Inkundla, as well as Bantu World, the largest selling African newspaper, David Bopape, secretary of the ANC in the Transvaal and a member of the Communist Party, and many others. Many felt, perhaps unfairly, that the ANC as a whole had become the preserve of a tired, unmilitant, privileged African elite more concerned with protecting their own rights than those of the masses. The general consensus was that some action must be taken, and Dr. Mezumbozi proposed forming a youth league as a way of lighting a fire under the leadership of the ANC. In 1943, a delegation included Lembede, MDA, Sisulu, Tambo, Nkumu, and I went to see Dr. Zuma, who was head of the ANC, at his rather grand house in Sophiatown. Dr. Zuma had a surgery at his home in addition to a small farm. He had performed a great service to the ANC. He had roused it from its slumbering state under Dr. Sime when the organization had shrunk in size and importance. When he assumed the presidency, the ANC had 17 seconds 6 Ds in its treasury, and he had boosted the amount to £4,000. He was admired by traditional leaders, had relationships with cabinet ministers, and exuded a sense of security and confidence. But he also carried himself with an air of superciliousness that did not befit the leader of a mass organization. Devoted as he was to the ANC, his medical practice took precedence. Zuma presided over the era of delegations, deputations, letters, and telegrams. Everything was done in the English manner, the idea being that despite our disagreements, we were all gentlemen. He enjoyed the relationships he had formed with the white establishment and did not want to jeopardize them with political action. At our meeting, we told him that we intended to organize a youth league and a campaign of action designed to mobilize mass support. We had brought a copy of the draft constitution and manifesto with us. We told Dr. Zuma that the ANC was in danger of becoming marginalized unless it stirred itself and took up new methods. Dr. Zuma felt threatened by our delegation and strongly objected to our Youth League constitution. He thought the League should be a more loosely organized group and act mainly as a recruiting committee for the ANC. In a paternalistic way, Dr. Zuma went on to tell us that Africans as a group were too unorganized and undisciplined to participate in a mass campaign, and that such a campaign would be rash and dangerous. Shortly after the meeting with Dr. Zuma, a provisional committee of the Youth League was formed under the leadership of William Nakomo. The members of the committee journeyed to the ANC annual conference in Bloemfontein in December 1943, where they proposed the formation of a youth league to help recruit new members to the organization. The proposal was accepted. The actual formation of the youth league took place on Easter Sunday 1944 at the Bantu Men's Social Center in Eloff Street. There were about 100 men there, some coming from far away as Pretoria. It was a select group, an elite group, a great number of us being Fort Hare graduates. We were far from a mass movement. Lembede gave a lecture on the history of nations, a tour of the horizon from ancient Greece to medieval Europe to the age of colonization. He emphasized the historical achievements of Africa and Africans and noted how foolish it was for whites to see themselves as